In a previous video, I showed you the create database command, and we created a database container called My Company, and now we're ready to populate that database container with actual tables. So in this video, I'll show you how to create a table, also how to get rid of that table, and then we'll insert some data into the table. Now, the create table command, I'm over here in the context help of our SQL additions. This is one of those examples where there's a lot of various options for creating tables, and it can be kind of overwhelming to read all this. But basically, we're going to create, you could choose the word temporary or not. We're not going to mess with that. We're just going to create table. We can type if not exists. We'll give it a name. And then they have three things here: create definition, table options, and partition options. For my videos, we'll never mess with this partition options. If we go down to create definition, it's just basically we got to give it a column name and then define some things about that column, and then there's all sorts of optional words we can add. And part of the column definition deals with data types, in which we have a previous video talking about that. Now, in this video, we won't mess with a lot of these options, and in the next one we will, and then we'll insert some data to see what the effect is of having some of these options applied to all the different columns. So right now, let's just keep it simple. Let's just create a table, and up above here is the employee table that we're going to add. And again, in a previous video, we talked about the data types. So these are the data types that we're going to use for all of these columns in our new table. So if you haven't created your database yet, this was the command we used. And now we just type create table. And we got to give it a name. So let's just call it employee. I type enter, and now you need an open paren. And now at this point you start putting in your columns. And so for instance, I have one called employee ID, and you need to tell it what kind of data type. So we'll make it a small, and I'll tab over int, and you separate your columns with commas. So you put comma, I come down here and I'll do one called first underscore name. I don't put spaces in my column names, and in my case I'm doing naming things with camel case, so I capitalize the first first letter of each word, and that is a varchar. And don't forget, varchar needs a size, and so I will go 50 like that. And then now we need a comma, which I forgot. There we go. Having troubles typing. Comma. And now we'll do the email. And the salary. Now remember, the decimal data type has two things. It's the scale and precision. So in this case, I'm saying the precision is 8. So that's 8 total characters, or digits, that would probably be more accurately. And 2 of those can be on the right side of the decimal spot. And then finally, our higher date will obviously make a data type. And phone, even though those are digits, we're going to make that a character, a fixed length character data type of 14, because we're going to go ahead and store the parentheses and the hyphens, dashes. And then finally, the social security number. Again, even though they're numbers, I'm not going to do any kind of math or averages or summing of them, so I'll store those as a text data type. And then when we're done, we'll put a parenthesis. And notice I forgot to put commas, so I will go through and separate each one. The last one, we don't put a comma unless we do a table level constraint, which we'll do in another video. One other thing I will do right now in terms of constraints is, more often than not, you will have one column that is going to be the primary key, right? That unique identifier that uniquely identifies every row. And so I will put the word primary key next to the employee ID column up here. And so that will define for us that this column, every value we put in there, which has to be an integer value, has to be unique. And I could not have any blank null values in that column because I've told it it's going to be a primary key. All right, that's about ready to go. I'll put a semicolon at the end. But before we run it, one more thing I want to mention is that when you type SQL commands, it's not case sensitive, but I always like to try to make the keywords capitalized so I can recognize keywords over the actual names of the columns. And notice that in MySQL Workbench it color codes the keywords anyway. The other thing I do once in a while, I'm not super consistent at this, is I put this parentheses on separate lines, and that's only so that I can recognize that they're there and I haven't forgotten them. Remember in MySQL Workbench I got this cool feature, the format painter. Well, I call it a painter, but it's just the format icon. So when you click on that, they do this, which looks nice. It's nice to have that indented. And then they went ahead and put the one parenthesis up there and then the other parenthesis here. You put a semicolon at the end of the statement. So recognize this is all one statement. Once in a while I get students confused and they think you need a semicolon after each line, but no, it's after every statement. Realistically, you could type this as one ginormous line, but when you type any kind of code, it's all about legibility. And so you format like this, it's only so that it becomes easier to read. The actual parser that reads through this doesn't care, right? It could be one ginormous line, but humans do care because it makes it much easier to read when you format and make it look as neat as possible. All right, so let's run this. I will select it and hit the lightning bolt. And if you can see my output statement down here, I got the green check. That's a good sign. And so then you run over here to your tables and oops, there's a test table. But if I hit refresh, we'll end up with my employee table. Now, of course, there's nobody in it. So let's add one of our employees into our employee table. So in order to add employees, we're going to, I'll scoot all this up. We're going to do an insert into. So insert into, and then you name the table where we're going to insert an employee. Now, just as a reminder, I'm running over here to the snippets. Remember, there's two kinds of, actually there's four, but for now there's two kinds. DDL, SQL Data Definition Language. That's anytime you're trying to create your objects. So you're creating tables, creating databases, or create schema in this case, or you're altering those things, you're dropping those things. That's called DDL. Now, which is what we've done so far, create database and create a table. Now we're actually adding some data to it. We're going to insert, and then later in other videos we'll do an update and delete, and right now we're going to do a select here in a couple seconds also. Now I opened up the insert syntax help over here, and again there's a lot of optional things. Into, the word into is optional. I like it because it just makes sense to me. Insert into. And then you list your table name. After the table name, we're not going to mess with the partition option, but you can choose to list all the column names. And then I put the word values, and then we'll put the values we're about to put in. Now, when can you put the column names and when do you not have to put the column names? If you're going to insert a piece of data into every column of that table, you can do it without listing those columns in the insert statement. If, for instance, I'm only going to put in the employee ID, first name and last name, and that's it, well then I have to specify those columns. And so we'll experiment with this in a couple different ways. Right now, let's go ahead and insert a value into every column, in which case I can jump straight to the word values. And then the trick is when you don't use the column names, which is probably a bad form not to use it, you're going to have to make sure that you put in the values in the exact same order that you created the table. So in other words, there's the employee ID. It's employee number 1. And because John is a piece of text, I'm going to put it in single quotes, comma, and then the last name is Zimmerman. That's a piece of text, so it also goes in quotes, or a string is another word for that. And then the email. That is also text, so I put it in quotes. I'm going to turn off this add-on screen so I can keep typing here without moving to another line. Now his salary is $50,000. That's a number, right? We said it's a number. It's decimal. So you just put in the value. Don't put in commas. Don't put in dollar signs, because then that becomes like a piece of text. And the hire date. On the hire date, SQL stores dates in the year, month, day format, and you do put those in quotes, which is the one weird thing, right? I try to get you used to putting text in quotes and numbers are not in quotes, but in this case we will put that in a quote. Oops, it was 02. And finally the phone. Now remember, put another comma, that is a string. That's a piece of text. We defined it right here as being character 14 or 11. So I'll put it like this. I'll go ahead and put my parenthesis. And then, whoops, I close it. And then comma for a new column. And finally another quote for the Social Security number. There. So now that became a long line, but we're insert into an employee values, and we're putting a value for every column of our table. That's why we didn't have to list the columns. So theoretically that should work. I'll put a semicolon at the end of that statement. I will run it. And we got, yep, we've inserted. Well, how do we verify that it's there? And that's where you get into a select statement. And we'll talk more about the select statement, but we're going to select every column from the employee table. And again, I'll put in a semicolon. You hit run, and it did it. I have one row returned. Of course, let's move this up so we can see it. There it is. Employee ID, John Zimmerman. There's all of our information. Notice we got the 0.00 here, even though I didn't put that on, and that was because of our decimal data type. There's our hire date, year, month, day, phone, and Social Security number. Now let me show you the syntax for the insert statement where you do list the columns, which is probably the safer way to do the insert statement. And that is you say into, like we did before, and you list your table, like we did before. But now we list what columns we're going to put things in. Now, of course, we have to include the primary key column. All right, and then just for fun, let's say we're going to put in somebody's last name, comma, and maybe just their salary. All right, later we're going to talk about making columns be not null, required. But for right now, I only have to put in things that I feel like it. The way I set up my table is nothing here is required except for that employee ID. And next video we'll talk about adding some not null requirements, meaning, oh, I have to have a value here. So right now, that's what that looks like. I got insert into, the name of the table, the columns that I'm going to put the information in. Now I use that word values again, and parenthesis, so I'll give this person a new ID, and the last name we'll make as Casey. Whoop, needs to be in quotes, that's a piece of text. And finally, the salary for Casey is $45,000. That is a number, so we do not put it in quotes. And that would look like that, and that should also run just fine. So let's try it. And I got my green check. So now let's select our data and see what happens. So we'll run that command. And there is, notice I got employee 2. We didn't put in a first name, so we end up with a null. I hate to use the word value, but a null holder there. There's the last name, and there is the salary. By defining right here the columns that we're going to put data into, the order doesn't matter that I list these. So in other words, let me copy this like this. I could have, maybe I'll switch these two. I'll put the salary right here, and I'll put the last name right here, right? But because I have them defined, I can put them in any order. But the important part now is that the data has to match how you defined your columns. So in other words, I need to put the salary right here and then get rid of this. So the order up here where you define the columns doesn't matter, but the data had better line up with what you've said the columns are going to be. So now let me run this, and we're going to get an error. I'll pull and put this semicolon. I suspect we will. Let's go ahead and run it. And notice the error that I got. Insert employee error code 1062 duplicate entry 2 for key primary. So what happened is, if you remember when we defined this table, we said this column is a primary key. And by definition, primary key means it must be unique for every row. Well, I tried to put this person in again with that same 2. Right? So I have to give this a new number. I can't use 2 because it's already been used. So by making it 3, now it should run okay. Yay, and now I'll have 2 employees named Casey, but one will be employee ID, let me move this up, employee ID 2 and one's employee ID 3, and they have the same salary. So there you have it. That was a quick introduction on how to create a table, and all we did was define columns. We defined a primary key, and then we did our data types. Next video we'll add some words out here, and we did a quick introduction to the insert command. So you can do it 2 ways. You can choose to list the columns, or if you're putting a value for every column, you don't have to list them. So here I didn't list them, but then I filled in every column. Here I chose to list just 3 columns, and I put in 3 values. The last thing I'll show you, and that is I want to get rid of this table because I want to create it again, or something's wrong with it, whatever. There is a drop command. This is a DDL statement, and it's pretty standard. When you want to get rid of something, you use drop, and then it's go, well, what do you want to drop? I want to drop employee. Oh, actually, you got to say drop table. All right, what was I thinking here? Drop table employee. So you got to say what is the object you're trying to drop. Drop table, and then give it a name, and I'll put a semicolon. And so right here. And by the way, I haven't hit refresh up here. Before I run it, let me hit refresh so you can see the employee table, and I will run that command, and it should be gone. And so without hitting refresh, it took it away. So not only is the table gone, but of course all of the data that I put in that table has now gone. As long as we're talking about, if I wanted to get rid of the entire My Company database, I can say drop database and My Company, semicolon. If I were to run that, I would lose my entire company database. Let's go ahead and do it. So I run it, and now My Company is gone. The beauty of writing your scripts like this and putting semicolons after them, which I tend to forget to do, is all I have to do to recreate them is just go rerun my script, and those would get recreated that quick.